As requested, here are a few pointers to help you in those long questions in Section B, which sometimes will require you to go as far as 1980. Now please remember, you don't need a huge depth of information here. A, you won't have the time to write, remember you've got 3/4 of an hour, and B, if you're going to be doing a broad brushstrokes approach to writing an essay, the depth that you will require is going to be quite shallow. There was a broad agreement between the major parties about the role of the state and the provision of welfare. Conservative Prime Ministers from 1951 to 64 supported the maintenance of welfare provision. Macmillan, who was Prime Minister from 57 to 63, agreed that there should be no return to the poverty of the pre-war period. He also believed that the wealthier classes had a moral responsibility to help provide for the poor, and understood that any cuts to welfare would be unpopular and would lose the Conservatives' electoral support. Now, some members of the Conservative Party, such as the Treasury Minister Enoch Powell, suggested that cuts should be made to welfare, but really he was in a minority. While the country could afford reasonable welfare provision, most across the political spectrum would support it. However, there were still significant areas of poverty, especially amongst the elderly, and many people continued to live in inadequate housing. When Labour came back into power in 1964, they refused to cut welfare and even increased taxes to pay for it. The Conservatives, who got back into power in 1970 and ruled until 1974, appeared equally committed to welfare. The passage of the National Insurance Act of 1970 introduced a generous package of welfare benefits, extending welfare by giving pension rights to about 100,000 people who hadn't previously been covered by the 1948 National Assistance Act. It introduced an attendance allowance for people who needed long-term care at home. It established invalidity benefit for disabled people, and it increased the child allowance given to mothers. Rent subsidies were available for low-income families in a private accommodation, and there was also a means-tested family income supplement in 1970 for poorer families, and they offered various means-tested rebates. So interesting to see that there was a continuation of means testing at this time. Having said that, there were challenges. You see the appearance of what is called the New Right. Now, the New Right argued that social welfare, including unemployment benefit, trapped people in a culture of dependency, and they argued that growing welfare bills were diverting resources from economic growth, and they were contributing to Britain's long-term economic performance being undermined. The benefit system, of course, was increasingly expensive, and as part of the terms of the 1976 IMF loan, the Labour government had to retrench and cut welfare budget. Overall, there's an emerging consensus that Britain just simply could no longer afford to provide welfare from the cradle to the grave. And in that respect, there's another consensus appearing. The old consensus was that you keep on extending welfare to as many people as possible, but now we see a different type of consensus appearing, one that, yes, we should be looking after the poorer members of society, but there should be a reduced amount of welfare provision. There's also a generational shift which had an impact on attitudes to welfare. Younger people were less inclined in the 1970s to endorse the collectivist thinking. Remember the collectivist thinking that we'd seen with the New Liberals? That had emerged increasingly in the Depression and the Second World War. They supported policies favouring the individual rather than the community as a whole. And they were criticising welfare claimants as scroungers, never mind about individual circumstances. Large sections of the working classes were aspirational. Their goals were to increase their standard of living, buy their own homes and enjoy consumerism. So they got little sympathy for policy that meant higher taxes. And when Margaret Thatcher became Conservative leader in 1975, I don't think that's right actually, she embraced the New Right. Yes, she did become Conservative leader in 75, but she didn't get into power until later. she embraced the new right thinking on welfare, hoping to appeal to aspirational voters. So the Conservatives go into the 1979 election presenting welfare as bad for the recipient, bad for the economy. Now, during the period 1951 to 1979, the NHS was reformed in certain ways under successive governments. Now, to start off with, Macmillan, you can see him down there on the left-hand side, his Conservative government introduced the hospital plan. Now, this led to the creation of 90 new hospitals. It redesigned and modernised 134 hospitals, and it refurbished 356 hospitals. So we knew that the infrastructure of the hospitals during the time of the creation of the NHS was pretty ropey, and this was trying to tackle that particular weakness. Now, the next one, the guy in the middle, is Sir Keith Joseph, the Conservative Secretary of State for Social Services. And what he did was introduce the NHS Reorganisation Act in 1973, introduce a new management structure to the NHS, and, of course, led to a significant growth in management costs between 74 and 79. Now, Dr. David Owen, Labour Minister of State for Health, under Labour obviously, 74 to 76, he established the Resource Allocation Working Party. Now, what this did was it identified areas of health deprivation and allocated additional resources to the neediest areas. Now, the impact of the NHS was an improvement in healthcare, which saw reductions in all categories of disease except for one, and that was the diseases associated with old age. It facilitated medical advances, so life-threatening diseases such as cancer, heart disease had much better recovery rates, and incidences of infant mortality and postnatal complications were significantly reduced. Naturally, this comes as a cost, and NHS spending really increased from 3.5% of gross domestic product in 1950 to 5% of gross domestic product by 1979. Now, as we said, the increased costs of the NHS were quite considerable. The number of prescriptions as early as 1948 had risen to 13.6 million. Previously, in the previous year, it had only been 6.8 million. So you can see the success almost breeds more success and more requirement for drugs, of course. Between 1949 and 64, more medicines became available, and once again, increasing NHS drug costs. In 1964, the NHS spent 250% more on drugs than it had done in 1951, and particularly vaccinations. The only vaccination given routinely prior to this had been smallpox, but by 64 there were vaccinations against diphtheria, TB, polio, whooping cough and tetanus, and they were all universally available and accepted. Now, there were serious problems. Infrastructure. Now, as we know, there had been some investment, but there was still a problem. They were only partly successful, and there was an increasing demand on NHS resources as new treatments developed, leading to rising expectations and growing costs. Now, having said that, we still spent less than other European countries. For example, in 1970, we spent 4.5% of GDP. Sweden in 1970 was spending 7.2%. The Netherlands was spending 6%, and Germany was spending nearly 6% as well. The numbers of consultants and the nursing staff increased by 66% between 64 and 79, and technical staff increased by 300%. As the population aged, demands on the NHS increased. The NHS performed 64,000 hip replacements in 1979, and major surgery increased during this time, especially organ surgery such as heart bypass operations and organ transplants. In 79, the NHS was performing about 800 kidney transplants a year and 5,000 bypass operations. Now, obviously, there's getting towards a crisis regarding spending because there's a growing demand and because of the growing age of the population. And healthcare provision remained uneven across the country and in different branches of medicine, in particular the provision of mental health care. By the late 70s, it was no longer assumed that economic growth would continue and support ever-increasing spending on healthcare. However, having said that, whoever was going to start making cuts in the NHS was going to find a huge public backlash. Now, as we know, education had been reformed and there had been created a tripartite system. But of course, the tripartite system was regarded, particularly on the Labour left, as socially divisive. In practice, grammar schools received the most resources, while many secondary moderns were underfunded and provided a curriculum which a lot of people found completely unsatisfactory. Grammar schools took on average 20 to 25% of the most able children, while the remainder went to secondary modern schools. The Crowther report found that 80% of secondary modern schools were deficient in some respect. Meanwhile, very few technical schools were ever built. They never had more than 3% of the total number of pupils, and their intake was overwhelmingly male. So we see a move towards the idea of comprehensive schools. Now, critics of the tripartite system, had hoped for fully comprehensive schools which would have seen children of all class backgrounds attend the same schools with no 11+ exam. And they were intended to offer what the Prime Minister of Labour said, Harold Wilson, called grammar schools for all. Now, the first purpose-built comprehensive opened in Kidbrooke in 1954, and there had been some kind of increase in the number of comprehensives, mainly in Labour local authorities. They included all children regardless of ability, and they gave pupils the opportunity to transfer between streams of attainment and different courses. They wouldn't just be more flexible, it was believed, but by taking greater numbers of pupils, they'd be able to offer a greater variety of courses and more resources. So the Conservatives looked again at it and published, as I said, the Crowther report in 1959, and it recommended ROSLA, raising of the school leaving age. It's not some Polish plenipotentiary, it is raising the school leaving age to 16. It also wanted to create county colleges for post-16 education. They wanted to create technical colleges and develop more sixth form courses. The Newsom report in 63, Half Our Future as it was entitled, and the reason it was called Half Our Future was because 50% of the children, it argued, were receiving poor educational provision, and particularly in inner city schools. So it advocated that schools should help develop curricula that was suitable for all pupils, not just academic pupils, and that there were links between deprivation, and poor educational attainment, and these needed to be investigated more thoroughly. Everybody knew that was probably the case, but it was all pretty much hearsay. Things hadn't been investigated in any depth, so they wanted to see whether this was true, or more or less to sort of see to what extent it was true. So 64 to 79, you see the development of comprehensive schools. The Labour government in 1964 was committed to the development of comprehensive education, but recognised it couldn't force the local education authorities, the LEAs, to adopt them. There was a policy document, Circular 10/65, which encouraged them to do so. And yes, you've guessed it, by using money as blackmail through financial pressure. So most LEAs abolished selection and created comprehensive schools during the 70s. Now, they were controversial. Critics felt that educational standards were slipping, and in the 1970s there was the Black Papers from conservative educationists who criticised progressive education, and then in 76 a government-sponsored Yellow Book saying that standards of behaviour in schools and schools aren't accountable sufficiently, and eventually, of course, when Conservatives got in, all hell broke loose in the comprehensive system. Now, very briefly, the post-war period. You've got footnotes on this, hopefully, I think. The Second World War involved the majority of Britain's adult female population in some kind of war work or in some kind of active service, whether that be voluntary or whether it was paid. The fragmentation caused by wartime experiences meant that in the immediate post-war period, many women were happy to return to the primary role as homemaker, mother, especially as the men folk returned home. The 1950s then have been viewed very much as a golden age of family. Women firmly as the linchpin. I particularly like the second advert there. As, do you mean a woman can open it? Yes. Suddenly, women who had been perfectly proficient at changing tyres on huge lorries and thought nothing of stripping down an engine were expected to go back into the house and be treated like the little woman, not really knowing how to do technical things. The media in particular depicted women primarily as homemakers, as you can see in those pictures there, despite the fact that more did work and working class women still had a largely menial and badly paid work in addition to domestic duties. By the late 1950s, surveys were starting to show a different picture, with women increasingly feeling isolated and discontented with their role and status in society, very similar to what had gone on in America at this time as well. The 60s and 70s were decades of challenge, really, to the traditional family structure through more liberal legislation, as you can see on this slide here. There were also economic problems, which meant that either unemployment or the need for both adult partners to work in order to maintain their lifestyle. Now, when I say unemployment, I mean if the man was made unemployed, then the woman very often would go and look for jobs. Very often it was easier for a woman to find a job because of her willingness to work part-time and, of course, in the 60s, to accept a lower wage. If the traditional family and women's role within it had not yet broken down, it was certainly under threat at this time. Right, talking about this legislation, we've got the divorce legislation, which was made far easier because of these two particular changes here. There was the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1937, we know about that, but this one here, the Divorce Reform Act of 1969, made divorce easier for couples living apart. It introduced the idea of a no-guilt divorce, whereas before evidence of cruelty, desertion or adultery had to be shown. There was even quite a good little industry in photographers who would set up evidence of adultery. So you sort of arrive at a hotel room, there'd be somebody there waiting for you. They took an incriminating photograph, which was staged obviously, and then that meant that the divorce could go through. Well, as a result of these no-guilt divorces, the divorce rate grew from 45,794 to 74,437 by 1971. Now, Mary Stopes in the 20s had founded the first birth control clinic in London, in spite of great opposition throughout the country, but it wasn't really until the widespread introduction of the oral contraceptive pill in the 1960s that women really felt in control of their reproductive processes. Nevertheless, many conservative-minded critics argued that it encouraged sexual promiscuity, and I suppose that's why the 1960s were known as the swinging 60s. I can't remember them. I was a mere child. Right, the Abortion Act 1967. It had been illegal in Britain, but figures as to its practice vary from about 100,000 to 250,000 per year. Backstreet abortions, very, very dangerous. 35,000 wealthy women could have abortions in relatively safe conditions in the care of medical professional personnel. Others, of course, went to these backstreet abortionists in sanitary environments, considerable risk. Many lost their lives. The Liberal MP David Steele introduced the bill, the abortion bill, in 1967, which allowed legal termination up to 26 weeks gestation if two doctors certified that continued pregnancy could lead to health risks for the mother. Now, this didn't necessarily mean physical health risks, it also included mental health risks. So if the woman felt suicidal, that was also. The years 1951 to 79 saw a period of sustained economic growth, which lasted until the early 1970s. Within this, there were signs of economic problems: underinvestment in industry leading to relatively low productivity, a continued trade deficit leading to weaknesses in sterling, inflation, worsening industrial relations. But in spite of all this, and in spite of the temporary periods of improvement in the economic situation, by the end of the period, Britain's economy was experiencing serious problems from inflation and union unrest. The period 45 to 51, when Labour was in power, has been called the age of austerity because there was little opportunity to improve living standards. Now, this is a result of economic difficulties. There was very little money coming in, there were huge war debts, that kind of thing. Many manufactured goods were needed for export in order to get that kind of income which the government needed to establish the NHS and that kind of stuff. So items such as clothing, furniture remained in short supply at home, and some rationing continued and even extended. The Labour government was forced to introduce bread rationing between 46 and 48, and bread had never been rationed during the war, so this came as a huge shock to people. Clothing was rationed till 49, and something called utility furniture was restricted to newly married couples or people who'd been bombed out during the war. So there was a great deal of number of shortages. The winter 46 to 47 was incredibly harsh, probably the worst one that in the post-war years. And from December 46 to March 47, the country was partially paralysed by snow and ice, and this led to significant problems for industry and for domestic comfort because coal stocks had been depleted by the war. Electricity supply to industry and homes was cut, and only could get hold of it for 19 hours a day. So factories were closed and unemployment started to rise. Now, the government feared the country might run out of food because a quarter of all the sheep were lost during this time. The farmers just couldn't get to them to feed them. Root vegetables were frozen into the ground, and food reserves declined to such an extent that Canadian and Australian citizens began to post food parcels to British families. Now, things did improve. The Festival of Britain made sure that Britain tried to forget about the bad old times and instead looked forward to the future. Britain was benefiting from Marshall aid and general post-war recovery, and conditions were improving. The Festival of Britain showcased Britain's technical and scientific expertise. The affluent society became the phrase used to describe Britain up until about the end of the period that we are looking at. There's a rapid growth in living standards because there's a global economic boom throughout the post-war era. Britain's welfare state had ensured a basic standard of living for most of the population. Energy prices were relatively low, certainly until the early 70s. There was a bit of an oil crisis then. A commitment by Labour and the Conservatives to full employment helped the situation. The trade unions were quite strong at this time, and what they were able to do was to negotiate fair wages for their members. Average wages had risen, and there was more consumer credit available. In 1957, Harold Macmillan famously declared that most of our people have never had it so good. Home ownership increased, consumer spending increased, and so did consumer credit. And now, having said that, there was poverty. There were pockets of deep deprivation, usually in the areas of the traditional industry, strangely. The elderly poor were very, very vulnerable, and in 1966 the housing charity Shelter was founded to help the 12,000 homeless people and the tens of thousands who were living in